mean, so many friends, and this is a community, and you know, it means more than a reading of a book. This is what we're all about, and it's going to take all of us to get going.
Yeah.
I should remark that Terry Timmis Williams had her first alcoholic drink with me in Moab, Utah, in the year Ed Abbey died, and it's been downhill ever since. And, anyway, thank all you guys, Elk River Books, for
Elk River Books.
Wednesday, I filled in for Andrea, who had to get like a real kind of job, you know, and it's the first time I've had an 8 to 5 in about 35 years. And so I know for a fact these guys, you know, aren't lighting their cigars in $100 bills. So go see Terry, that'll help out a lot. You know, when I start a book, I never know where it's going. I've never known the end of a book. It's, the process takes me there. I know maybe a couple other writers have the same problem, but you know, I start something, I hit a roadblock, I go down an alley, and this book is no exception. You know, and my books are never about one thing, and this is certainly you know, about several things, and it's not, you know. It does have a lot of stories of adventures, got some archaeology in it, some paleontology, and a lot of stories I've just dragged in from the field over the years. But you know, the origin of this book was about 1997. I was living out the Grizz Fork, the foot of the Absarokas, looking up at the tops of the mountains, and the mountains were all turning red, you know? And so were the tops of the mountains all the way around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And what that meant, quite simply, is the temperature's been warming up for about 5 years in the winter temperatures, and it had allowed, you know, the pine beetle larva to overwinter another life zone higher up in the whitebark pine trees. And this happened really fast, and you know, it blew us away, you know, amateurs and professionals alike, and with, you know, and with the death of that whitebark forest, and it's really complete now. I mean, functionally, it's gone, and we're not going to bring it back in a lifetime. But you know, whitebark pine nut is also the most important food source of the Yellowstone grizzly, which is really a unique grizzly bear ecosystem in that it's based on a stone pine nut. And, you know, and so that was really bad news, you know. I've often said, and not quite flippantly, that, you know, the fates of humans and grizzlies are mingled, you know, destined to a common fate in a common habitat. And so I said, you know, you got to do something about this. And you know, I did what I could, but I also decided I was going to write a book. And I already knew quite a bit about modern global warming, and so I wondered what kind of book I was going to write about that. And you know, I'd read all this stuff, and it wasn't good. And including, you know, James Lovelock, father of Gaia, you know, and I was going to just paraphrase him, but it's better to read his own words, you know. So this is where I was in 1997, and this is what Lovelock says. By, you know, in 20, 50, 60 years, nobody knows, it's soon. You know, the Earth's population will be culled from today's 7 billion now, maybe, to as few as 500 million. He means that 6 out of 7 people are going to die on this planet. And billions of us will die, and a few breeding pairs of people that survive will be in the Arctic, where the climate remains tolerable. I'm not sure Lovelock, who's in the late 80s now, living in Devon, England, is part of the breeding population anymore. But anyway, he thinks in about 20 years the Sahara will be moving into Europe, and Berlin will be as hot as Baghdad. Atlanta will end up as a kudzu jungle. Phoenix will become uninhabitable. And part of Beijing, desert, Miami, rising seas, and London floods, etc., etc., etc. The Chinese, you know, and it's going to drive agriculture out Africa totally, and also South Asia, where they will move north into Siberia and duke or nuke it out, you know, and it goes on and on. The Chinese have nowhere to go but Siberia. Lovelock hopes that it doesn't degenerate into dark ages with warlords running things. This print's real small, isn't it? Which is a real danger. Yeah, it's a cheap book. Anyway, so I read this. I have no argument with Lovelock. I think he's much more right than wrong and everything. And but the word that came to mind was bummer. Just bummer. I mean, you know, do I want to talk to school kids about this stuff? And I didn't think I could, you know. And yet, you know, the beast of our time is global warming. And I wanted to talk about it in such a way that I could talk to school kids without lying. And so I decided to kind of go in the back door with, you know, with global warming has happened to Homo sapiens one other time. You know, Homo sapiens have only been, you know, evolved in Africa for about 196 years. And we have experienced global warming before, and that was about 15,000 years ago, right here in North America. It's when people showed up and the place was full of saber-tooths and short-faced bears and all that kind of stuff. And so, you know, I dashed off. I said, well, hell, you know, I know the evidence is thin, which would allow a scientist like me to bullshit a little bit. And also it would be more a parable than a parallel, because I know there's not enough data to tie down direct parallels. But, you know, it was the inspiration that inspired me. So I dashed off a 2.5-page letter to the Guggenheim Foundation, and, you know, a little time passed, and this guy showed up on the porch with 2 shopping bags full of $100 bills. It's amazing. So I got into the research, and I went to Greg Keeler. I said, Greg, I need to borrow your library card, you know, because this is and I had to do all this research. I had to read all these academic, you know, and there were thousands of papers that I had to read and dozens of books, and I started getting into this, and I said, man, you're a little long in the teeth, you know, you got 1 foot in the grave, you're going to die before you finish this book. And so it did occur to me, I don't know if I actually voiced this to Andrea, but I said, maybe I have to give the money back. But that was the real problem, because, you know, I got the Guggenheim money, and right off the top, I spent 1/3 of that money on 2005 Bordeaux futures. So anyway, listen, I'm going to just read a few opening paragraphs to this book, which will show what I intended in the book. It's a little pompous, and whether I get there or not is another question. You can decide that for yourself once you read it. But, you know, here's what I was trying to do. For the past 12,000 years, the world has enjoyed a relatively stable climate. Now the time of predictable global weather has ended. The future will be unsettled, probably fiery, and likely terrifying. Forces have been unleashed that threaten the future of our children. The early consequences of global warming have already settled over the planet. Has this kind of climate change ever challenged humans before? It certainly has. Most recently, right here in North America, when people first colonized this continent. About 15,000 years ago, the weather began to warm, melting the huge glaciers of the late Pleistocene. They caved off as icebergs and caused the oceans to rise. The Americas were probably uninhabited by people then, but teeming with gigantic and fierce animals, many capable of killing and eating human beings. That's a kind of critter after my own heart. In this brand new landscape, the largest of all unoccupied wilderness regions human would ever explore on Earth, people somehow adapted to unfamiliar habitats and dangerous creatures in the midst of a wildly fluctuating climate. And they made it through. Along the trail of the first migration into the Americas lie challenging illustrations of courage and caution for modern people. Though the rough outline of this journey is delineated by modern science, what drew me into the wild heart of the first American story was the adventure, the exploration, the danger, wondering what it was like to live with huge pack-hunting wolves, lions, saber-toothed cats, and gigantic short-faced bears. To hunt now extinct horses, camels, and mammoths. To top a ridge somewhere in what would become Alaska and look out at unending wild country that encompassed 2 continents, uninhabited by humans. It was the first and only time since Adam and Eve emerged from Eden that our species would come in to so vast a land. A wilderness 5 times the size of Australia, and never before glimpsed by an upright primate. Wow. Here was beasts both fierce and wonderful. Some species had not previously encountered people, including a number of predators, and especially a short-faced bear. This guy stood, you know, the biggest ones are 7 foot at the hip, you know, and they commonly weighed a ton. And you know, more about that later. That's why people didn't get here sooner. You can't eat just one. I can't think of a richer, wilder, more perilous time to live. For a person like myself who loves wilderness, this time in America had to be the ultimate journey. Heroic, bold adventurers, facing down danger at every bend of the river, surviving against impossible odds. Of course, the first Americans didn't think of themselves like that. Just finding adequate food and shelter, you know, embraced all shades of courage. I'll just read a few more paragraphs, which again, just shows what I was after, trying to get through. As a naturalist of sorts and an advocate for wildness, I try to make a difference through my work. The central issue of my generation is a human-perpetuated wound we have inflicted against life support systems of the earth, whose collective injuries are increasingly visible today as climate change. Should humans push through another population bottleneck, we will drag down much of the wild earth and almost the large animals with us. And that's a rub. Not that it's unfair, which it is. But can people thrive without the habitats in which our human intelligence evolved? They gave rise to that bent of mind that we call consciousness. Homo sapiens evolved in wilderness landscapes that are in part still with us. Can we hope to endure when that homeland vanishes? When I decided to write a book about people first coming to America during the late Pleistocene, I had the importance of wilderness and modern global warming rattling around in my brain together. What do they all have in common? Again, the biggest wild landscape ever glimpsed by Homo sapiens was the 2 Americas, two totally uninhabited continents. And all the prehistoric action takes place in lands whose remnants today we call the wilderness. And of course, I believe that the conservation of wild habitats will play a decisive role in our attempts to adapt to the current climate shift to global warming. The book is a long argument for the value of wilderness beyond, you know, everything I've said before, but as a survival mechanism for what's coming. Our own organic consciousness evolved within wild habitats, from the African savanna all the way to the frozen tundra of the north. Evolutionary awareness was shaped by the mammoth we hunted, by the great cats and bears who sometimes stalked us. And as the lynx still sculpts snowshoe hare evolution, what forces today yet hone the human mind that was born of foraging? Modern people sometimes insist they exist apart from nature, the conditions that gave rise to human awareness, those habitats whose remnants we now call the wilderness. But today nature has reasserted herself. The signs are dire. Will we heed the warnings? The Pleistocene predators are gone. A child in danger, a dark alley, or a personal brush with tragedy generates an appropriate emotional response, far more easily than a distant but predictable ocean ride that could displace a billion starving human strangers. Once again, we live in dangerous times, and navigating these treacherous waters will require sharpening that ancient perception of risk. It might not be a bad idea to try to hang on to some of the original landscape. That's my job in life, you know, defender of wilderness. And in this whole book, human adaptation to climate change is the underlying common theme, both, you know, the 15,000 years ago and today. However thin the threads of evidence illuminating adaptation to ice age global warming, I wanted to follow them to some speculative conclusion, even if it merely adds up to a wild guess. Direct comparisons between the 2 periods of climate change are impossible, rendered unproductive by unmistakable lack of evidence. You know, it's a hard data is really thin for this period. But the older journey is a great adventure, closer to mythology than science. Life in the Pleistocene is our original emergence story. Our own American Odysseus was out there fighting off Ice Age Sabertooth and bears with his spear while pursuing mammoth and other giant beasts. Anyway, that's what I tried to do in here. There's not nice little, there's kind of, my typical dork stories are inserted, you know, in this book, which I can read a few of, but, you know, they're not long sections. But let me just give you the big picture right off the bat. First, you might want to grab your wine. No, I can't make a run for you right now, buddy. But anyway, you know, the history, here's, you know, not even 101, you know, kind of, yeah. It's the history of Homo sapiens on planet Earth. Well, okay. Modern humans showed up in Africa about 196,000 years ago. And as always, you know, was following what climatologists think was, you know, a long, prolonged drought. Climate change is a great driver of human evolution. Even 2 million years ago or more now, when you know, when the human brain doubled and they started using tools, you know, that was driven by 200,000 years of a wildly fluctuating climate. So, you know, it's still with us. And anyway, they were in Africa, and about 70,000, maybe 73,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Sumatra blew its lid, and it was the biggest volcanic eruption in 2 million years, you know. And of course, it was whatever you want to call it, the nuclear winter, whatnot. Homo sapiens in Africa went through a bottleneck, and some geneticists, and you know, one of the reasons I wanted to give up on this project is I had to, you know, I knew nothing about like genetics, you know, which is rendered in an unfathomable idiom. You know, you can barely read this stuff, and I had to learn about it. But anyway, the same people tell us that the number of humans on the planet might have gone through the low thousands then. About 70, so you know, about 70,000 years ago, they fled Africa. By 65,000 years ago, modern humans crossed the Red Sea, so they must have, you know, they must have boats. Europe was occupied by Neanderthals then, and these guys skirted, you know, skirted Europe and headed east into Asia. They got to Asia, and by at least 55,000 years ago, had made it to Australia. And you know, going to Australia means, you know, you're outside the land. It means, you know, serious navigational skills. It implies, you know, fishing, which implies the use of nets, and you know, and at every interglacier, you know, we have a series of shallow seas that are incredibly productive biologically. And this was the time, you know, when people just went everywhere. And so that means that, you know, you had people, seagoing people, and that hit Australia. They're also in Japan up the coast, you know, and by 50,000 years ago, there are people in Asia. And then one of the fundamental questions is, you know, would these early mariners have sat sunning themselves on this South China Beach for another 30,000 years ago before wanting to explore maybe North America, you know? I mean, there's plenty of reason for not going to North America. You know, the Pacific Ocean is fierce, cold, and terrifying, and the Arctic, trips to the Arctic were daunting. But anyway, by 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had gone everywhere, you know, including the Arctic. They pioneered all these habitats. Hordes of prototypical modern humans were moving into Neanderthal-occupied Europe. They're all the way, you know, in the northern Urals, in the Arctic, and they basically colonized everything except Antarctica in North and South America. You know, and that's a big question. Why not the Americas? And so my book sort of starts at the earliest time that Americans could, that the first Americans could have showed up. And that's about 30,000 years ago. And the only data we have, the only information, is we know that about 3,000 miles to the west of the Bering Straits, there were rhinoceros hunting people up there, living, you know, north of the Arctic Circle. And while, you know, there's a great blank in the archaeological record between, 30,000 years ago and 14,000 years ago. No one's found anything. And so, there's a lot of lack of evidence in this story. And we cannot always presume that just because we haven't found it, it still isn't there. But, the other suggestion comes from human genetics, that archaeologists don't trust this. What they want is, a date on a thing, an organic thing that puts people in a place at a particular time. You can't date genetics. But anyway, genetics suggests there might have been people hanging around what they call Beringia, which was all of, the Bering Strait and Alaska and Siberia all at once. But, there were people hanging around there maybe 30,000 years ago, and they didn't make it south about 15,000 years ago. But again, those are big questions. Why? And, the thing that keeps, I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but, there's zoology is always there. And, the short-faced bear was this gigantic animal, and it was all through, the Americas. It was, it didn't make it to South America, and it didn't cross the Bering Strait. So it's a uniquely American beast, and it was probably a scavenger, and it was probably, it was quite capable. It had huge long legs, and it could, it had a gait where it could, run down puny humans in the open without any trouble at all. It probably couldn't turn on a dime, but so what? And, and actually, paleontologists and archaeologists don't like to speculate and stuff like that. But I mean, nobody got a foothold south of the ice in North America until these guys were really on the way out. Of course, the reason they were on the way out is what they fed on. The great megafauna of the Pleistocene was also going out. But it was, the idea of living, with animals that kill and eat you. I have a little passage here I wanted to read because it's not something we modern people live with very much. But since this story involves some local people, I thought I'd read it. Okay. Here, the seminal moment in the life of a hunter arrives when he finds himself the hunted. That dread second when he's frozen in his tracks at the edge of the meadow. By the eerie silence in the forest, he feels a primordial but familiar tenseness clamping the back of his neck, and he realizes that he's being stalked as prey by a large beast. This ancient relationship doesn't present itself to the modern world as frequently as it did prior to the Industrial Age, or especially during the last days of the Pleistocene. In fact, predation on human beings is so uncommon today that when a single lion, bear, or tiger emerges from the bush to stalk, kill, and sometimes eat a human, it generates international news and best-selling books. A much chronicled modern account tells the story of a Siberian tiger's vengeful attack on a man named Markov, a poacher who had previously hunted and wounded the huge cat. This vendetta took place during December of 1997 near the Amba River and the Beacon River drainage of Russia's Far East. And this predatory tiger incident was first chronicled in 1998 by the renowned Russian bear and tiger biologist Dmitry Peacock. And the details of that were good enough that this guy wrote a whole book of it in 2010. This guy's a good writer. It's not a great book. I had to read it a whole bunch of times because it turns out I knew that tiger. Okay. And here, I'll just read a few details from the book so you know what we're talking about. Here's the Russian investigating author. He's never seen a fellow human so thoroughly and gruesomely annihilated. The Russian accent ain't gonna cut it, okay? Forget that, man. Okay, it looks at first like a heap of laundry until one sees the boots. Luminous stubs of broken bone protruding from the tops. The tattered shirt with an arm still fitted to one of the sleeves. Yeah, and etc., etc., etc. The tiger who killed, dismembered, and ate Markov waited for him a long time, perhaps days, lurking near the door of his cabin. Okay, so it's premeditated. About this time, as I read on, A chill ran up my own neck. Something about this tiger sounded familiar, you know. Anyway, male tigers, like grizzly bears, this is what I think, grow each, I mean, I know it's true of grizzly bears, but I think male tigers grow each year of their life too, you know, and size and dominance play a great role. And in Siberia, these male tigers have exclusive ranges. They're large ranges. Anyway, I crossed the tracks of the tiger in question 4 miles southeast of the attack site back in 1992. So I'm going to read this little thing. It's got a couple local people in it, okay? Dmitry Peacock, a renowned biologist, and I were a two-person tent mates on a kayak trip down the Wild Upper Beacon River in 1992. Yeah, our journey was a buddy trip with 5 American friends, Jim Ellison, Doug Tompkins, Rick Ridgway, Tom Brokaw, and Yvonne Chouinard. Famed kayakers and mountain climbers, well, all except myself and perhaps Brokaw. We spent about 3 weeks in Siberian tiger country, the last 10 days fishing and paddling down the Wild Beacon. We ran into Dmitry in a place when we were trying to get rid of the Russian bureaucracy, which, you know, they just open up and it was awful, but anyway. In order to visit the countryside, we were told, it is necessary to secure a permit from the Bureau of Tourism. The Director of Tourism offers us a river trip using our own kayaks for only $2,100 American. A truck and motorboat will accompany you at all times, he says. This is not exactly what we had in mind. I stare out the window of what until recently used to be the Communist Party building. A pretty girl is walking her cow down the street. This is banditry, says Brokaw, who along with Jeb has acquired the unsolicited job of group diplomat. We're getting nowhere. Jeb stands up and announces, we're out of here, we're going home. But we were just actually sneaking off. Okay. By fortune, we run into Dmitry. He knows we are interested in preserving wild country. And his greatest accomplishment was establishing a Beacon River Native Reserve. If any of you guys ever saw Desu the Hunter? A wonderful book, a wonderful film. This is exactly it. These are Udahe people too. Okay? Anyway, Dmitry says, you must see it, he says. Hyundai wants to cut it all down and Moscow will cave into them. Okay. The die is now cast. We decide to ignore warnings that we must get permission from the KGB to travel. We will try to bribe a helicopter pilot on our own to fly us and our fold-up kayaks into the headwaters of the Beacon River. It can be done, we hear. We dig into our pockets and come up with a roll of cash. We pass on to Dmitry. We find a chapter. Dmitry says, speak no English. And he covertly passes the roll to the pilot. Soon we are airborne. We have a single map. The country is huge with no trace of man upon the land. The map shows the middle tributary of the Beacon River, you know, unfurling counterclockwise, etc., flowing through eroded volcanic hills and cliffs of colored basalt, finally hooking into the Beacon. That's where we want to go. Yvonne and I look out the open window of the big military-style Aeroflot helicopter. So this is I don't like helicopters. They used to shoot at me in Vietnam, you know? And this is the first helicopter I've been on since Vietnam. And it's not just a helicopter, it's one of those Rambo things, you know? It's a giant, anyway. Okay, so anyway, we opened the port that Rick has opened in order to take some photographs. Ridgway and I didn't have a lot of money, so we had to solicit a job to pay for the expenses, okay? And anyway, so, you know, I'm looking out. As our only map of the area is passed back to me, I stupidly grab it in front of the window. In a heartbeat, half the map, the half that shows the Ziva and all the country we plan on kayaking, rips off and is sucked out the window. We are now mapless, and I wonder what my carelessness portends. The boys, especially Tom, will later make me pay heavily for this blunder, as the two of us vie for worst in kayaking skills. Nonetheless, rivers tend to run downstream, so we couldn't get that lost, you know. And anyway, You know, so we go on river, and at the very end of the river is the Amba. This is where this guy was killed and eaten. The same river, Amba means tiger in Udahe. Okay, so I'll just read a little passage here. The Amba is also prime tiger habitat. China lemon vine grow on the smaller trees, and cow parsnip and nettles make up the understory. You know, this is our last day in the wilds tonight. We paddle on down to a big Udahe village tomorrow, where we can hire a truck and haul us in our fold-up kayaks to the Trans-Siberian Railroad. We climb. We're going up the Amba River now with Dimi, who's you know, who's camped and lived and studied on this country for 30 years. We climb a steep hill to a ridge. There's wild boar and black bear sign everywhere. That's not our black bear. That's Eastern, you know, it's the Asian black bear. Tibertonus is the species. Dimitri signals for us to be quiet. Our crew is noisy, distracted, self-absorbed, talking of the industrial collapse and geopolitics. Dimitri snaps at us to shut up. We can hear movement down the ridge. Up ahead we hear the breathing sounds of big animals, probably bears huffing away or boars snorting, all running downhill now. We blew it. The world is only as big as we allow it to be. Wild places and animals pass along their secrets only if we listen. You have to pay attention. A touch of danger would help. You need to know you can die. A surprise rapid the size of Lava Falls, a bad stretch of black ice across an ice chute, a whiteout on a glacier, or maybe a bear, or especially a tiger. But it's hard here on our last day out before the slow return home. It's especially hard in a group. The social dynamics can drain you of vital curiosity and attentiveness. Anyway, we drop back down to the Amba bottomland, finding an old trail. Suddenly, Dimitri freezes and motions me forward. A tiger track glistens in the mud. The track in the wallow appears to be only a day old, about 5 inches across. A male cat that has replaced a previously dominant male cat who was killed by a poacher. The young tiger leaves scrape marks every few hundred meters and spray scents on territorial tree markers. We stop at such a tree. The bark has been rubbed off by Asian black bears, who are also attracted to the strong scent. I get down on my hands and knees and press my nose against the bare trunk. The pungent feather of tiger fills my nostrils, and, just for a second, I travel with a big cat, orange and black stripes flashing, barely perceptibly, through the sea of green undulating cone fern, into the wild and predatory world that not so very long ago was my very own. That was the same cat, same age, everything, you know? And it's just, somehow, that, you know, that apparent coincidence didn't hit me as startling. You know, I've been ambushed by a grizzly. I don't know what it means, and you know, I believe in the sentience of some of these large predators. The sentience of large predators is unlike what you see gazing into the orbs of a chimp or your favorite Labrador retriever. The tiger with a vendetta or bear with a memory stirs a different set of sensory responses cast deeper down in our brainstems. Okay, what time is it?
8 o'clock.
Oh, geez, already? Okay, I'm going to read one more thing. Okay, and I'm not, you know, the most wonderful part of doing this book is so much of the final history of the colonization of North America. The key and most important site is about 20 miles from here. It's right up there. And I'm not sure I'll have too much time to talk about that, but I mean, okay, so, you know, people had to get down there, and the short-faced bear, I think, really impeded, impeded any movement. Now, when the global warming came, the glaciers started to melt, and one could get down through the icebergs of the Pacific Northwest coast. You know, you couldn't have done it on foot. You wouldn't have needed boats because you had to go out around some really big glaciers. Now, believe it or not, in the archaeological literature, this is a major debate, whether people walked or if they had boats, which is one question. The second question, or if they practiced a maritime economy, which means like eating clams and oysters, you know. And, you know, and they have giant debates about this stuff. So, you know, the fact is that the amount of water flowing into the Pacific Ocean back then was even greater today because those glaciers were bigger. And you know, we may get there ourselves, but you know, it's a lot of water. And you know, I haven't spent the last 25 years doing conservation up there. You know, it's not a coastline. It's a fractured, fjorded, dissected coastline with archipelagos. You know, and fjords that, you know, 15,000 years ago were full of ice, and as they recede them, they're great arms of the ocean. You know, they're miles across, they reach inland for 100 years. And these guys are saying that, you know, they could have walked down and they didn't need boats. And so, anyway.
You don't believe it.
How can you tell? All right, here's another dork story. Take it too far. Sooner or later, coastal voyagers would reach a body of water that required boats. Big rivers, fjords, or wide inlets. In my own experience, this includes treacherous rivers that dump directly into the deadly rough surf of the Pacific Ocean. On the outer coast of southeastern Alaska, for instance, there are two dramatic sections of coast that are cut by narrow, short, but swift rivers draining from receding glaciers. I wanted a backpack along one of these stretches of coast, and this is from my notebooks here. If you carried a portable raft, I pondered, you might be able to paddle or swim across the river before its current dumped you out into the pounding waves of the open ocean, where you would most surely drown. I mean, these are really short. They come out of glaciers, and they go right into that Pacific surf, and when it's exposed to Japan, you just die. You know, it's the pound. You hear the pounding of the surf on your deathbed. It's so dominant. Okay, so it took me over a decade to get up my courage and raise enough cash for a bush plane to drop me off on this utterly stark, uninhabited coastline. I had also invested in 60 meters of thin climbing rope and a $29 small blow-up raft, lighter for backpacking than an inner tube. Okay. The river crossing presented itself on day 3. The river was fast, flowing with intermittent rapids, a mere 100 feet or so across and lined with bucket-sized boulders. The only place to swim across was a relatively flat 200-yard length, a half a mile above the ocean, where the river disappeared into a white waterfall of surging death waves. Just miles uphead towered the bluish head of the glacier. I stripped down the long underwear and tennis shoes, blew up the tiny 2-person raft, and stashed my backpack. The end of the rope was securely tied to a chain of big rocks. I walked upstream, carrying the raft and rope, which I had tied in a bowline around my waist, but I also carried a very sharp knife to cut the sucker if I had to, you know, in case of entanglement. If the current was too much, I figured, the rope would swing me back down shore, you know, downstream, you know, and I'd get another chance at it. A rope's length above my pack, I eased into the icy water, keeping the raft on my downstream side. I had no intention of getting in the flimsy craft. It was merely a flotation device. I kicked off the rocks and side-stroked like hell for the opposite bank. In this glacial river, you had maybe 10 minutes of lucidity before hypothermia set in. I stroked vigorously, eased off, let the current carry me down below a big rock, then swam as hard as I could for the far shore. The river carried me down below where I'd left my backpack. I was about to run out of rope and get swung back to the bank where I'd started. I gave one last desperate lunge toward the far shore, grabbed the rock, then another, and slowly pulled myself free of the icy water. I was across. Losing no time, hypothermia was a concern. I walked upstream with a raft as far as the rope could reach. Again, I secured the rope to a very big rock. The rope was now, formed an acute angle with the river. I fastened the raft to the rope with a carabiner hooked onto both with breakaway clips and slid back into the water. This time the angle was right, and I virtually slid down the line back across the river to my waiting backpack. Now I was truly cold. I took a break, kindled a fire, and warmed to the task, which was getting my pack across the river. I hauled my pack and the raft as far upstream as the rope would reach and tied it off again. This time anchored to chocks that I could dislodge once I was across the river by, yanking the rope from upstream. The backpack fit awkwardly inside the raft, but I tied it in as best I could and hitched the package to the line. I pushed off and worked my load along the rope, getting sucked under once with all my gear. Stepping out on the far bank of the freezing river, I stripped off my soggy clothes and shook like a shaggy dog. Here, with modern mountaineering equipment and all my fanciest 20th century gear, I managed to cross one very small river without drowning. The first Americans down the coast would have had many hundreds of such rivers to cross, with infants, grandparents, and all their belongings. We can only imagine their ordeal. But if they traveled this route, it's hard to see how they made it without boats or practicing a maritime economy. You know, I'm just going to mention this, and it's, you know, there's a lot of dork stories like that in the book, but there's also some long, you know, the science is well researched. And just in passing, you know, the Americas, no doubt people came down the coast. There's no evidence of that, but no doubt they did. There were people living south of the glaciers before the mammoth hunters showed up. The mammoth hunters are called Clovis people, and they likely came down the corridor. But there was a smattering of people around. They're called pre-Clovis people. There's not many of them. They're present, you know, their toolkit is kind of tiny, nondescript artifacts. They didn't thrive anywhere. Now, you know, it's easier really living, and they came down by raft. Why didn't they stop, you know, at Malibu and, you know, eat the salmon and live off the live oaks and whatnot, and, you know, shellfishing? You're walking down on a road of, you know, broken mussels, clams, and shellfish. You could have set up at any place, pumped out babies, you know, but they didn't. They didn't do that at all. Nobody did it until the elephant hunters show up, and who are also credited with contributing highly to the extinction of the megafauna, which happened you know, almost 13,000 years ago. About 12,888 years ago, everything went extinct. Whether that is precise date from ice cores is from a comet or something else, no one really knows. But the megafauna was on the decline because of global warming, and it's quite probable that these elephant hunters put the finishing touch on all these animals. And a case can be made for Montana causing the paleo extinction of the great megafauna of the Pleistocene. And it's because, you know, there's one Clovis burial in the world, and it's up by Wilsall. And, you know, it's a site that, for one thing, it has elk antlers as for, you know, they're how they mounted these giant spear points called Clovis points to, you know, the spears and whatever, you know, kind of a reloading device. Okay, they're elk antler. Well, elk, that's at first, and the date is, you know, 13,100 years ago, more or less, you know. That's the first record of elk in the lower 48. Elk are very recent to North America. I mean, you know, grizzlies only got here 70,000 years ago. Humans probably got here no earlier than 30,000 years ago. But the elk didn't get here until that global warming, you know, started 14.7 thousand years ago. They had to wait for the corridor to open. And the fact that they show up, you know, one of the earliest Clovis sites in the world, and probably the most important, is at Wilsall, means they came down the corridor. And, you know, there's lots of controversy. And, you know, but the key site is this Clovis site out by Wilsall. And, you know, it's, again, that's our legacy. It was discovered by workmen, you know, with a front loader, getting some fill for a school, and it was discredited and ignored for 40 years. But it's hot academic property with, you know, these big shot archaeologists pulling out from the corners of under the corners of the continent to jet up here to take a piece of the chart.